I'm holding a letter that's turning my entire life into a lie. My hands are shaking so violently that the paper sounds like autumn leaves in a windstorm. The ink is faded but not faded enough. Not nearly faded enough to make the words disappear. The handwriting is unmistakably his, Harold's careful cursive that I used to find on birthday cards and grocery lists and love notes tucked into my purse. But this isn't a love note. "My dearest Margaret," it begins. Margaret. Not me. Not Eleanor. Not his wife of 50 years who buried him just 3 months ago. I found this letter 20 minutes ago while cleaning out Harold's desk drawer, the one he always kept locked. The one he said held boring business papers, nothing important, Ellie. The key was in his old coat pocket, the navy wool one that still smells like his aftershave and the peppermints he always carried. I wish I had burned that key. I wish I had thrown that coat away with everything else. I wish I had left that drawer locked forever. But I didn't. And now I'm sitting on our bedroom floor, reading words that are shattering everything I thought I knew about the man I loved for more than half my life. I dream about our life together, about what we could have been if circumstances were different. Our daughter asks about you every day. The letter is dated 15 years ago. Harold was already sick then, his hands beginning to shake with the Parkinson's that would eventually take him from me. But apparently he was still healthy enough to write love letters to another woman. A woman who gave him something I never could. I'm 73 years old and I'm learning that everything I believed about my marriage, my husband, my life, was built on a foundation of lies. If this story is already stirring something in your heart, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now and which city or state are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. Let's see how far this story is reaching. 3 months ago, if you had asked me to describe my life, I would have smiled and told you about contentment. About a love story that spanned 5 decades. About Sunday morning pancakes and evening walks around the neighborhood and the way Harold still held my hand during movies, even when arthritis made his grip weak and uncertain. I would have told you about our little house on Maple Street, with its blue shutters and the rose garden Harold planted for our 10th anniversary. How every morning for 50 years he brought me coffee in bed, cream, no sugar, and kissed my forehead before I was fully awake. How he'd hum old jazz standards while shaving, his voice carrying through our small bathroom and into the bedroom where I'd lie listening, feeling blessed to wake up to such simple joy. Perfect, I would have said. We had a perfect marriage. The irony isn't lost on me now. Perfect. What a foolish word. What a dangerous, naive, foolish word that I wrapped around my life like armor, protecting myself from seeing what was really there. We never had children. It was the one shadow in our otherwise sunny life. The one prayer that never got answered despite years of trying, years of hoping, years of doctor visits that always ended the same way. Keep trying, they'd say. These things take time. But time ran out as it always does, and eventually we stopped talking about nurseries and baby names and started talking about vacations and retirement plans instead. Maybe it's for the best, I'd tell myself during those dark moments when grief threatened to overwhelm me. Maybe God has other plans for us. What a cruel joke that turned out to be. Harold was so good about it. So gentle. He never made me feel broken or incomplete even when I felt like both. When I cried on Mother's Day, he'd hold me and say, "We have each other, Ellie. We're enough." When I lingered too long outside the toy stores at Christmas, watching parents shop for their children, he'd take my hand and distract me with stories about our own childhood memories. We're enough. I believed him. God help me, I believed every word. I thought his gentle acceptance of our childlessness was proof of his love, evidence of his contentment with our life together. I never imagined it might be because he had a child somewhere else. Someone else's child who called him daddy and waited for him to come home. Our life was quiet but full, or so I thought. Harold worked at the bank for 37 years, steady and reliable as sunrise. I taught 3rd grade until I retired, and every Christmas our refrigerator was covered with cards from former students who'd moved on to high school, college, marriages of their own. We took trips. Nothing fancy, just weekend drives to see fall leaves or visit his sister in Vermont. We had rituals. Friday night Chinese takeout, Sunday morning church, Tuesday evening walks that became the heartbeat of our weeks. When people asked about our secret to a long marriage, Harold would wink and say, "Never go to bed angry and always tell the truth." Then he'd squeeze my hand and I'd feel that familiar warmth, that sense of being exactly where I belonged. Always tell the truth. Always tell the truth. The cruelest part isn't the betrayal itself. It's how masterful he was at making me feel loved while he was lying. How he could look me in the eyes every single day and make me believe I was his everything, his only, his choice. How he could bring me coffee and kiss my forehead and hum those jazz standards while planning his next trip to see them. I sit in this empty house now, surrounded by 50 years of carefully curated memories, and I wonder how many of them were real. How many times he said he loved me while thinking of her. How many times he held me while wishing I was someone else. How many times he came home to me with their laughter still ringing in his ears, their scent still clinging to his clothes. How many times he made love to me while his heart was miles away. Harold and I met in 1972, at a church picnic on a sweltering July afternoon that would change the course of my entire life. I was 23, wearing a yellow sundress my mother had sewn from fabric we'd bought on sale at Woolworth's, helping serve lemonade under a tent that provided little relief from the oppressive heat. The ice was melting faster than we could serve the drinks, and my hair was sticking to the back of my neck despite the careful victory rolls I'd spent an hour perfecting that morning. He was 25, recently returned from Vietnam, standing awkwardly by the dessert table like he wasn't sure he belonged anywhere. There was something about his posture, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped behind his back, that spoke of a man who'd seen too much and was still learning how to exist in a world of church picnics and small talk and normalcy. I noticed his hands first. Clean, careful hands that shook slightly when he reached for a piece of my apple pie. The tremor was subtle, barely noticeable, but I'd become good at reading people during my student teaching year. Some scars were visible, others weren't. He had dark hair then, thick and unruly, and eyes the color of storm clouds, gray-blue and intense, like they were always looking for something just beyond the horizon. When he smiled at me over his paper plate, something in my chest fluttered like a bird taking flight. "Best pie I've ever had," he said, though I'd seen him take only one small bite. "Liar," I replied, surprising myself with my boldness. "You haven't even finished it." He laughed. A real laugh, not the polite chuckle most people offered strangers. It was the kind of laugh that started deep in his chest and worked its way up, transforming his entire face. "You caught me. Truth is, I'm too nervous to eat properly. There's this beautiful woman serving pie, and I'm trying to work up the courage to ask her name." Beautiful. No one had ever called me beautiful before. Pretty maybe. Sweet. Nice. The kind of girl mothers wanted their sons to bring home. But never beautiful, never in the way that made a man's voice catch slightly when he said it. "Eleanor," I said, wiping my sweaty palm on my apron before extending it. "Eleanor May Patterson." "Harold James Whitmore," he replied, taking my hand in both of his. His touch was warm, steady despite the slight tremor I'd noticed. "Pleasure to meet you, Eleanor May Patterson." "Just Eleanor is fine." "I think I prefer Eleanor May. It sounds like someone who bakes perfect apple pies and knows how to make a man feel welcome." We talked for 2 hours that afternoon, long after the lemonade ran out and the other volunteers started cleaning up around us. He told me about growing up on a farm outside town, about his father who died when he was 17, about the 2 years he'd spent overseas that he didn't want to discuss yet but might someday if I was patient. I told him about my dreams of teaching, about the 3rd grade classroom I'd been assigned for the fall, about my mother's garden and my father's woodworking shop, and how I'd never been anywhere more exotic than my aunt's house in Pennsylvania. "Would you like to go somewhere exotic?" he asked as we walked toward the parking lot, his hand hovering near my elbow like he wanted to touch me but wasn't sure he was allowed. "Like where?" "I don't know. Paris, London, maybe somewhere with better apple pie than this church social." "I told you the pie was good." "The pie was perfect. But I was thinking maybe next time you could make it just for me and I could tell you properly how perfect it is." That was Harold. Always smooth, always charming, always knowing exactly what to say to make a girl's heart skip. I should have been suspicious of such easy charm, but I was 23 and had never had a man look at me the way he did, like I was something precious he was afraid of breaking. We were married 8 months later in the same church where we met. I wore my grandmother's lace dress, altered to fit my smaller frame, and Harold wore a new suit he'd bought specially for the occasion. When Pastor Williams asked if anyone objected to our union, Harold turned around and grinned at the congregation like he was daring someone to try. His confidence was infectious. Everyone laughed and I felt like the luckiest woman alive. "I love you, Eleanor May Whitmore," he whispered during our first dance, and the way he said it made me believe in fairy tales. The early years were golden, painted in the warm hues of young love and infinite possibility. We rented a tiny apartment above Mrs. Chen's flower shop, where the scent of roses and baby's breath drifted through our windows every morning and the floors creaked so loudly that Mrs. Chen always knew when we were awake. It was barely 500 square feet with a kitchen so small that only one of us could cook at a time, but it felt like a palace because it was ours. Harold was working his way up at First National Bank, starting as a teller and dreaming of bigger things. He had ambitions, not just for money but for respect, for the kind of solid reputation that would make our future children proud. I substitute taught at various schools around town, learning different classroom management styles and saving every penny we could for our future house. Our future. We talked about it constantly, planning every detail with the intensity of architects designing a cathedral. We'd lie in bed on Sunday mornings, the church bells ringing in the distance, planning it all out. 3 bedrooms. One for us, one for guests, and one for the nursery. A big kitchen where I could bake pies like my mother taught me, where our children could do homework at the table while I cooked dinner. A garage where Harold could tinker with cars, his secret passion, and maybe teach our sons how to change oil and rotate tires. A yard big enough for children to run in with a swing set and maybe a vegetable garden. "How many kids do you want?" I asked him once, tracing lazy patterns on his chest in the dim morning light filtering through our cheap curtains. "As many as you'll give me," he said, capturing my hand and kissing my fingers one by one. "A whole house full. Christmas mornings with so many presents under the tree we can't find the floor. Summer evenings with kids running through sprinklers and laughing so loud the neighbors complain. What if we can't have children?" I asked, voicing the fear that sometimes crept into my quiet moments. "Then we'll adopt. Or we'll spoil other people's children. Or we'll travel the world and have adventures instead. But Ellie, we will have a good life. I promise you that." I believed him. God help me, I believed every promise he ever made. We tried for children with the same careful planning we brought to everything else. I tracked my cycles on a calendar, took my temperature every morning, read every book about fertility I could find. Harold was patient, romantic, even turning what could have been clinical into something that still felt like love. Month after month we hoped. Month after month we were disappointed. "Maybe next time," became our mantra. Maybe next time. After 3 years of trying, we sought medical help. I remember sitting in Dr. Morrison's office, Harold's hand gripping mine, while the doctor explained the tests they'd need to run. Blood work, x-rays, procedures with complicated names that made me blush just thinking about them. "We're in this together, Ellie," Harold said in the car afterward, his voice steady despite the fear I could see in his eyes. "Whatever it is, we'll face it together." Together. The word that defined our early marriage. Together we faced the tests, the procedures, the monthly disappointments that grew harder to bear with each passing year. Together we endured well-meaning relatives asking when we were going to give them some grandbabies to spoil. Together we learned to change the subject when conversations turned to child-rearing, to smile and nod when friends announced pregnancies, to leave baby showers early when the sight of tiny clothes and cribs became too much to bear. The medical results were inconclusive, the most frustrating answer possible. Nothing definitively wrong with either of us, but nothing definitively right either. "Sometimes these things just happen," Dr. Morrison explained with practiced sympathy. "Or don't happen in this case. But you're both young and healthy. Keep trying. Keep trying." As if we hadn't been trying with every fiber of our beings for years. Harold threw himself into work during those difficult years, climbing steadily up the bank's hierarchy. Assistant manager, then loan officer, then branch manager. He was naturally good with people. Steady, trustworthy, the kind of man customers felt comfortable entrusting with their life savings. His boss praised his dedication, his attention to detail, his willingness to work whatever hours were necessary to get the job done. "Building our future," he'd say when I complained about the long hours, the missed dinners, the way he sometimes came home so tired he could barely speak. "Saving for that house, for our family. For our family." Even as the years passed and our family remained just the two of us, Harold never stopped planning for children. Never stopped believing that someday our house would be full of laughter and chaos and the beautiful messiness of family life. Or so I thought. Looking back now, I wonder if his extra hours at work were when it started. If somewhere in those late nights and weekend conferences, Harold began building a different kind of future. One that didn't include me as the mother of his children. The first sign something was wrong came in 1995, but I was too trusting to recognize it. Harold started working late more frequently. Not every night, but often enough that our Tuesday evening walks became irregular, then sporadic, then rare. When I asked about it, he'd sigh and rub his forehead in that way that meant he was stressed. Budget season, he'd explain. Corporates breathing down our necks about quarterly reports. You know how it is. I didn't know how it was, actually. I'd never worked in banking. But Harold had never lied to me before, so I believed him. I made his dinner and kept it warm in the oven, sometimes until 9 or 10 o'clock. When he finally came home, he'd eat quietly while I sat across from him, trying to fill the silence with stories about my students or neighborhood gossip. He seemed distracted during those dinners. Present but not present, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. When I asked if everything was okay, he'd reach across the table and squeeze my hand. Just tired, sweetheart. Work's been brutal. Sweetheart. He'd always called me that, but around this time it started to sound different. Automatic. Like a habit rather than an endearment. The phone calls started shortly after. Strange calls at odd hours. 7 in the morning before Harold left for work, 9 at night when he was in the shower. Whenever I answered, the line would go silent for a moment before disconnecting. When I mentioned it to Harold, he frowned and said it was probably telemarketers. They're getting more aggressive these days, he said, not meeting my eyes. I'll call the phone company about getting our number changed. He never called the phone company. The calls continued. Then there were the business trips. Harold had traveled occasionally for work before, maybe once or twice a year for regional banking conferences. But suddenly he was gone every other month, sometimes for 3 or 4 days at a time. They're expanding, he explained when I questioned the frequency. Opening new branches in neighboring states. They need experienced managers to help with transitions. It made sense. Harold was good at his job, respected by his colleagues. Of course they'd want him involved in important projects. I tried to be supportive, packing his suitcase carefully, making sure he had everything he needed. But something felt off. He was secretive about the trips in a way he'd never been secretive about anything. When I asked which hotel he'd be staying at, he'd be vague. Some chain hotel. Nothing fancy. When I suggested I might come along sometime, maybe make a little vacation out of it, he'd shake his head quickly. It's all business, Ellie. Boring meetings and paperwork. You'd hate it. I would have hated it. But I would have loved being with him. Why didn't I push harder? Why didn't I demand details? Why did I just accept his excuses and smile and wave goodbye? Because I trusted him. Because in 23 years of marriage, Harold had never given me a reason not to trust him. Because I couldn't imagine, literally could not fathom, that the man who brought me coffee every morning and kissed my forehead before I was fully awake could be capable of deception. The changes in our physical relationship were subtle at first. Harold had always been affectionate, holding hands during movies, surprise hugs while I was cooking, slow dances in our kitchen when a good song came on the radio. But gradually those touches became less frequent. When we made love, which was happening less often, he seemed distracted. Panical. Are you okay? I asked him once, lying in his arms after what felt like an obligatory encounter. You seem distant lately. Just work stress, he said, but he didn't look at me when he said it. You know how it is during budget season. It was March. Budget season had been over for months. The most painful moment came in 1997, during what should have been a perfect evening. It was our 25th wedding anniversary, and Harold had made reservations at Giovanni's, the same Italian restaurant where he'd proposed. I wore the blue dress he'd always said was his favorite, and I'd spent extra time on my hair and makeup. We sat at the same corner table where he'd gotten down on one knee all those years ago, sharing a bottle of wine and reminiscing about our early days. For a while it felt like old times. Harold was attentive, charming, present in a way he hadn't been in months. Remember our first apartment? He said, twirling pasta around his fork. How the floorboards creaked every time one of us moved. And the radiator that sounded like a dying animal, I added, laughing. Mrs. Chin was always apologizing for it. You never complained though. Not once. I loved that apartment. I would have lived there forever if you'd wanted to. Harold's expression shifted then, just for a moment. A shadow passed across his face and he looked away quickly. When he looked back he was smiling again, but it felt forced. Good thing we didn't, he said. We've built such a good life together, haven't we, Ellie? Such a solid, stable life. Solid. Stable. Not passionate. Not romantic. Not the kind of love that makes your heart race after 25 years. Solid. Stable. Like a business partnership. Yes, I said, because what else could I say? We have. He reached across the table and took my hand, and for a moment I thought he was going to say something meaningful. Something that would explain the distance I'd been feeling, the changes I'd been noticing. Instead he raised his wine glass. To 25 more years, he said. To 25 more years, I echoed, but the words felt hollow in my mouth. Later that night, as we were getting ready for bed, Harold's phone rang. It was almost 11 o'clock, far too late for a business call. He looked at the phone, then at me, then back at the phone. I should take this, he said, already moving toward the hallway. Might be important. He was gone for 20 minutes. When he came back, I was already in bed, pretending to read. Everything okay? I asked. Emergency at the bank. Water pipe burst in the basement. They need me to come in early tomorrow to deal with the insurance adjusters. On a Saturday? Banking never sleeps, he said with a weak smile. He left at 7 the next morning and didn't come home until after dinner. When I called the bank's main number on Monday to ask about the water damage, the receptionist seemed confused. Water damage? No, Mrs. Whitmore, we haven't had any water damage. Everything's been fine here. That was the moment. That was when I should have confronted him. That was when I should have demanded the truth. But I didn't. I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen, staring at the yellow walls we'd painted together, and I made a choice. I chose to believe there was some explanation. I chose to trust that my husband of 25 years wouldn't lie to me about something important. I chose to be naive. The final escalation came 2 years later, in 1999, just before Harold's 50th birthday. We were planning a party. Nothing elaborate, just close friends and family in our backyard. I was addressing invitations when Harold's sister called. Eleanor? It's Janet. I'm so sorry to do this last minute, but Tom and I won't be able to make it to Harold's party. Oh no. Is everything okay? Tom's mother fell and broke her hip. We need to fly to Arizona to help with her care. But we'll make it up to Harold, I promise. Maybe we can take you both out for a nice dinner when we're back in town. Of course, don't worry about it. Family comes first. You're so understanding. Harold's lucky to have you. By the way, how did his trip to Chicago go last month? He mentioned he might have to travel there for work. My blood turned to ice water. Chicago. Yes, he said the bank was considering opening a branch there. He was going to spend a few days checking out potential locations. Harold hadn't mentioned Chicago. Harold hadn't traveled anywhere in months. I was sure of it because I'd been keeping track, making note of his schedule so I could plan dinners and social events around his absences. Oh, that, I said, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. Yes, it went fine. Good. Well, give him our love. We'll see you both soon. I hung up the phone with trembling hands. When had Harold gone to Chicago? And why hadn't he told me about it? I started thinking about all the times his stories hadn't quite added up. All the phone calls that went silent when I answered. All the late nights at work that never seemed to result in overtime pay. All the business trips that he was so vague about. All the times he'd seemed like a stranger in his own skin. That night, I waited until Harold was asleep. Then I did something I'd never done before in 27 years of marriage. I went through his wallet. I found restaurant receipts from places we'd never been together. Gas station receipts from towns hours away from our home. And tucked behind his driver's license, I found a small photo. A little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with Harold's dark hair and his storm cloud eyes. She was sitting on a swing, laughing at whoever was taking the picture. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, were the words, "Daddy's girl always." I stared at that photo for what felt like hours, sitting on our bathroom floor in my nightgown, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Daddy's girl. Harold was someone's daddy. But not mine. Not ours. Never ours. I put the photo back exactly where I'd found it, crept back to bed and lay awake until dawn, listening to my husband's peaceful breathing and wondering how long he'd been living a double life. Wondering if I'd ever really known him at all. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The photo was just the beginning. A terrible prologue to a story I wasn't ready to read. The letter I found today, the one that's still clutched in my shaking hands 3 hours later, that's the final chapter of everything I thought I knew about my life. 3 months ago, Harold died in his sleep on a Thursday afternoon in March. Peaceful, the doctor said. No pain. His heart simply stopped beating during what had become increasingly frequent afternoon naps. I found him there in his favorite recliner, the newspaper open on his lap, reading glasses perched on his nose like he'd just dozed off for a moment while reading about the weather. "He looks so content," the funeral director said, his voice professionally modulated to convey sympathy without overwhelming grief. Like he was ready to go. Ready. I remember thinking how cruel that word was. Ready to leave me behind. Ready to escape whatever burden our marriage had become. Ready to stop living the exhausting double life that had defined our last 20 years together. Or maybe he was just ready to finally be with the family he'd really chosen. The funeral was beautiful if funerals can be beautiful. The church was packed with Harold's colleagues, former students of mine, neighbors who'd watched us grow old together on Maple Street. Person after person told me how lucky I was to have had such a devoted husband, such a solid marriage, such a love story for the ages. 50 years, they kept saying, grasping my hands with their own, their eyes bright with tears for my loss. 50 beautiful years. What a blessing. I smiled and nodded and accepted their condolences, playing the role of the grieving widow while inside I was drowning in questions I couldn't ask and suspicions I couldn't voice. How do you tell people that you're not sure you're mourning the man they think you're mourning? How do you explain that you're grieving not just for your husband, but for the version of your marriage that you're increasingly certain never existed at all? After the service, Harold's boss from the bank pulled me aside. Martin Cooper was a kind man who'd worked with Harold for over 20 years, and his sympathy felt genuine. "Eleanor, I want you to know what a privilege it was to work with Harold all these years. He was one of the most dedicated employees we ever had. Always willing to go the extra mile, especially on those regional projects." Regional projects? Oh yes, he spent so much time helping with our expansions over the years. Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit. He probably spent more time in those cities than he did at home some months. Martin chuckled fondly, his face bright with admiration. But he always said it was worth it, that he was building something important for the future. Building something for the future. But not our future. Not with me. Did he travel to those cities recently? Even after he started getting sick? Oh goodness, yes. Right up until the end, practically. Just last year he was in Chicago for almost a week, helping to finalize some transition paperwork. Said he had some personal business to take care of while he was there. Personal business. In Chicago. Where I'd never been. Where Harold had told me there was nothing worth seeing. I went through the motions of widowhood for 3 months. Thank you cards for sympathy flowers, written in careful script on cream-colored stationery. Meetings with lawyers about wills and estates, conversations about assets and beneficiaries that felt surreal and businesslike. Slowly, methodically sorting through 50 years of accumulated life, deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to throw away. Harold's clothes were the hardest. I held each shirt, each tie, each pair of socks and remembered when he'd worn them. Our anniversary dinner. Christmas morning. Sunday church services. Each piece of fabric held a memory, and I wasn't sure anymore which memories were real and which were elaborate performances staged for my benefit. I saved his desk for last. That locked drawer I'd never been allowed to open, the one he'd guarded like a state secret for all these years. Boring business papers, he'd always said when I showed any curiosity about it. Nothing you'd be interested in, sweetheart. Sweetheart. That automatic endearment that had stopped meaning anything years ago but continued to roll off his tongue like a prayer learned by rote. The key was in his coat pocket just like I told you. The navy wool coat that still smelled like him. Like aftershave and peppermints and something indefinably masculine that I'd been breathing in for 50 years. I held that key for a long time before I used it, knowing somehow that opening that drawer would change everything. That whatever was inside would either put my suspicions to rest forever or confirm my worst fears in ways I wasn't prepared to handle. I should have thrown the key away. I should have left some mysteries unsolved. I should have chosen ignorance over truth. But I couldn't. After 50 years of questions, I had to know. The drawer opened easily, like it had been waiting for this moment. Like Harold had always known that someday, when he was no longer here to maintain his careful facades, everything would come spilling out. Inside were manila folders, neatly labeled and organized with the same careful attention Harold brought to everything else in his life. Even his deceptions were methodical, I realized. Even his lies were filed alphabetically. Financial records. Travel documents. Correspondence. Legal papers. Personal. I opened them one by one like unwrapping gifts I'd never asked for, presents that got more devastating with each layer removed. The financial documents showed regular transfers of money, our money, my money, to something called Family Support Trust. Hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years, siphoned away from our shared accounts and sent to support a family I'd never known existed. The travel documents told the story of Harold's real life. Hotel receipts, plane tickets, rental car agreements. All to the same cities his boss had mentioned. But these weren't business trips. These were visits home. Weekend trips. Holiday trips. Christmas 1995. Round-trip ticket to Chicago, December 23rd to December 26th. Christmas 1995. Harold had told me he was working Christmas weekend that year. That the bank needed someone to oversee year-end processing. I'd spent Christmas Day alone, heating up leftovers and watching old movies, missing him terribly but proud of his dedication to work. He wasn't working. He was celebrating Christmas with his real family. The photographs were the hardest to look at. Dozens of them spanning nearly 20 years. The little girl from Harold's wallet, but growing up in fast-forward through these snapshots. Birthday parties and school plays and family vacations. Harold in every single picture, smiling with the genuine joy I hadn't seen on his face at home in years. This was where his happiness lived. This was where his heart was. And there was a woman. Beautiful, younger than me with kind eyes and graying brown hair. In the later photos, she and Harold were wearing matching wedding rings. Matching wedding rings. I was home wearing mine. But it was the letters that finally destroyed me completely. The one I'm still holding. The one dated just 2 months before Harold's death. My dearest Margaret, it begins. Margaret. The name I'd heard on that phone call years ago. The name that had made Harold's face change in ways I was only now beginning to understand. I know this is the last letter I'll ever write to you, and that breaks my heart more than this disease ever could. I don't know how long I sat on that bedroom floor, surrounded by the evidence of my husband's secret life. The shadows moved across our bedroom walls as the sun traced its path from morning to evening, and still I sat there, reading and rereading those letters, studying those photographs, trying to piece together a narrative that made sense of 50 years of deception. 50 years. 50 years of marriage, and 20 of them were a lie. But were they all lies? Had any of it been real? The worst part wasn't the betrayal itself, though that cut so deep I could barely breathe around the pain. The worst part was understanding that Harold had been suffering too. That for 2 decades he'd been torn between 2 lives, 2 loves, 2 families. That every smile he'd given me, every "I love you," every gentle touch had been weighted with guilt and longing for someone else. How exhausting it must have been for him. How lonely. How lonely we all were, and none of us knew how to fix it. The letters revealed the full scope of his anguish. Margaret, the other woman whose name I could barely think without feeling physically sick, had pleaded with him multiple times to choose. To either leave me and be with them fully, or end their relationship and commit to his marriage. Harold's responses were tortured, full of love for both families and paralysis about hurting either. "I can't leave Eleanor," he'd written in one letter. "She's devoted her entire life to being my wife. She gave up her dreams of children for me, built her world around our marriage. How can I destroy that? But I can't leave you and our daughter either. She's the child I never thought I'd have, the family I never dared to hope for. How can I abandon that?" So he chose neither. Or both. He chose to hurt everyone by trying to hurt no one. I found Margaret's phone number in the last folder, written in Harold's careful handwriting along with her address in Chicago. For 3 days I stared at that piece of paper trying to decide what to do with it. Part of me wanted to call her and rage at the woman who'd stolen half my husband's heart. Part of me wanted to tear up the lawyer's documents, to keep Harold's money and let them figure out their own way forward. But that wasn't who I was. That wasn't who I wanted to be. Even after everything, I couldn't be cruel. On the 4th day I called. "Hello." The voice was soft, careful. Familiar somehow, though I'd never heard it before. Maybe because I'd imagined it so many times over the years, wondering who belonged to those silent phone calls. "Is this Margaret?" Pause. Then quietly, "Yes." "Who is this?" "This is Eleanor Whitmore. Harold's wife." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her shock through the phone line. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Mrs. Whitmore, I don't know what to say. Neither do I admitted. But I think we need to talk. Did he tell you? Before he died? No. I found letters. Documents. I know about your daughter. I know about everything. Another long silence. Then, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I know, I said and realized I meant it. Can we meet? I think we need to meet. We arranged to meet the following week at a coffee shop halfway between our cities. Neutral territory for two women who'd shared the same man without either of us knowing the full truth. I spotted her immediately. She looked exactly like the woman in Harold's photographs, though older now with more lines around her eyes and silver threaded through her brown hair. She was sitting alone at a corner table, nervously stirring a cup of coffee that was probably cold by then. When she saw me, she stood up so quickly she knocked over her chair. Mrs. Whitmore? Eleanor. Please, just Eleanor. We stared at each other for a moment, these two women who'd loved the same man in different ways, who'd been victims of his inability to choose. She was beautiful just like I'd expected. But she looked tired too. Worn down by years of waiting and hoping and accepting less than she deserved. I'm sorry, she said again, her eyes filling with tears. I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. Sit down, I said gently. Please. Let's talk. The story she told me over the next 2 hours broke my heart in entirely new ways. She'd met Harold in 1979, when he was in Chicago for what really was a business trip. She was recently divorced, working as a secretary at the bank's regional office, struggling to raise her 4-year-old daughter alone. Harold was kind to her, professional but warm, and when he asked her to dinner she said yes. It was supposed to be just one night, she said, tears rolling down her cheeks. Just a nice evening with a nice man who seemed interested in what I had to say. But then he came back the next month and the next, and before I knew it. You fell in love, I finished. We both did. But he was married and I knew that. I told myself I could handle it, that I could be satisfied with what he could give me. But then my daughter got attached to him, started calling him daddy, and everything became complicated. How old is she now? 31. Married with children of her own. Harold walked her down the aisle at her wedding 3 years ago. 3 years ago. The same weekend Harold had told me he was in Milwaukee for a banking conference. I'd been proud of his dedication to work, proud that his expertise was so valued. Instead, he'd been giving away one of the most precious moments a father could share with his daughter. He loved you, Margaret said suddenly, leaning forward with urgent sincerity. He talked about you all the time. How smart you were, how kind, how much you meant to him. He was tortured by this, Eleanor. Absolutely tortured. He never wanted to hurt either of us. But he did hurt us. All of us. Yes, she said simply. He did. We talked for hours that day, comparing stories, filling in gaps in each other's understanding of the man we'd both loved. Margaret told me about Harold's relationship with her daughter, how he taught her to ride a bike, helped with homework during his visits, never missed a school play or soccer game when he was in town. How he'd kept a photo of me on his nightstand in their apartment, because even though he couldn't be honest, he couldn't pretend I didn't exist. He was a good father, she said. But he was a terrible husband to both of us. We deserved better than half a man. He was right. We'd both been victims of Harold's cowardice, his inability to make hard choices. And somehow in that coffee shop, surrounded by the wreckage of our shared pain, we began to heal each other. We've stayed in touch since that day. Not friends exactly, the situation is too complicated for that, but something like allies. Women who understood each other's loss in ways no one else could. I've met her daughter, Harold's daughter, and her grandchildren. I've shared stories about Harold that they'd never heard. His terrible singing voice, his obsession with crossword puzzles, the way he cried during sad movies. They've given me pieces of Harold I never knew existed. And I've given them pieces too. The lawyers sorted out the financial arrangements according to Harold's wishes. I have enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life, and Margaret and her family received the larger portion of his estate. Money we'd all rather not have if it meant having him back, but money that at least allows us all to move forward without financial worry. Blood money in a way. Payment for the years of deception we all endured. I sold the house on Maple Street 6 months after Harold's death. Too many memories, too many ghosts, too many empty rooms that had been waiting for children who never came, at least not to me. I bought a small apartment closer to downtown, where I can walk to the library and the market and not think about gardens I planted with a man who was thinking of someone else. I'm learning to live in present tense instead of past perfect. Some days are harder than others. Some days I miss Harold so much it feels like drowning. But I don't miss the lies anymore. I don't miss wondering why my husband seemed so distant, why our life together felt so incomplete. I know now. He was incomplete because half of him was somewhere else. And now I'm learning who I am when I'm whole. I'm 73 years old and I'm starting over. Not because I want to, God knows this isn't the life I planned, but because I have to. Because living with the truth, even when it's devastating, is better than living with beautiful lies. Because I deserve to know who I really am when I'm not trying to be enough for someone who can't choose me completely. Do I forgive Harold? Some days, yes. Some days I understand that he was human, flawed, caught between impossible choices and too weak to make the hard decisions. Some days I remember the good times, and there were so many good times, and I feel grateful for the love we did share, even if it wasn't the love I thought it was. Other days I'm furious. Furious that he stole 50 years of my life. Furious that he let me believe I was broken when the real problem was that his heart was divided. Furious that he died before I could confront him, before I could demand answers, before I could decide for myself whether our marriage was worth saving. Most days I just feel tired. Tired of grieving a man who was never fully mine. Tired of rewriting 50 years of memories. Tired of explaining to well-meaning friends that my perfect marriage was built on a foundation of secrets. But I'm not giving up. At 73, I'm learning to live for myself in ways I never had to before. I'm taking art classes, learning to paint watercolor flowers that would make Harold's garden look plain by comparison. I'm volunteering at the literacy center, teaching adults to read, watching their faces light up when words finally start making sense. I'm building a life that's entirely mine. Margaret and I still talk every few weeks. We've become unlikely companions in this strange journey of discovering who we are after Harold. She's finally dating again. A widower who knows her whole story and loves her anyway. I'm not there yet and maybe I never will be. But I'm not closing the door on possibility anymore. The truth is I don't know what comes next. I don't know if I'll ever trust anyone completely again. I don't know if I'll ever stop jumping when the phone rings unexpectedly, wondering what other secrets might be waiting to surface. But I know this. I'm not the broken woman I thought I was for so many years. I'm not the failure who couldn't give her husband children, couldn't give him enough love to keep him from straying. I was married to a man who was incapable of choosing, and that says nothing about my worth and everything about his limitations. I'm learning to see myself clearly for the first time in decades. And you know what? I'm not so bad. If you've made it this far, thank you for walking this road with me. I hope this story gave you strength, or at least the feeling that you're not alone. Comment where you're watching from and maybe subscribe. Let's build a place where voices like mine, and maybe even yours, are finally heard. Because we all deserve to be chosen completely. We all deserve truth even when it hurts. And we all deserve to know who we are when we're not trying to be enough for someone else. We all deserve to be whole.